Good evening. My name is Megan Potente, Co-State Director for Decoding Dyslexia California. We are so excited to host today's event along with the San Francisco Parent Coalition. So welcome everyone to why and how to bring the science of reading and structured literacy into every classroom. We're also so thrilled to have longtime elementary principal Nancy Bui facilitating tonight. So welcome everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the event. My name is Nancy Bui. I've been a school administrator for 11 years, but this is my first year as a school parent. I'm a proud mom of 3 children under 6, and my son just entered kindergarten this school year. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. And as you know, reading for every young child is essential for them to thrive in school. So I'm more so wearing my parent hat tonight, and as I listen to our wonderful presenter. I am so excited to be on this journey with you as I learn more along with you. So let me explain our engagement process for tonight. Oftentimes when we do webinars, it's really hard to discern in the chat what the questions are. So we're going to ask that you use a Q&A icon for questions. It's right next to the raise hand, share screen. It's the Q&A with the kind of the square box. So type your questions in there. And then what I'll do is I'll monitor the Q&A for questions, and then we'll have a conversation with Margie at the very end based on what is shared in the Q&A. Now let's get to our main event. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Margie Gillis. Dr. Margie Gillis is a nationally recognized literacy expert and a certified academic language therapist who has been teaching children to read for over 40 years. In 2009, Margie founded Literacy How, Inc. to provide professional development opportunities and coaching for teachers on how best to implement evidence-based reading practices in the classroom. Margie has served as a board member and advisor to many national literacy organizations. She is also a research affiliate at Yale University's Haskins Laboratories, focusing on opportunities to empower teaching excellence. Margie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you for having me. So my title tonight, as Megan said, why and how to bring the science of reading and structured literacy into every classroom. And I'm going to jump right in because I have lots and lots of information to share. I'll mention to you that when you receive the recording for this evening, you'll also receive a copy of the slides. Literacy How is a nonprofit organization that provides mentor support to teachers in their classrooms. We empower teachers with knowledge so every child learns to read by 3rd grade. We believe that literacy is the language of opportunity, so kids are at the heart of all that we do. We know 95% of all children can be taught to read, so that is the benchmark that we hold. That is our target. And yet we have far fewer children that are reading. Our country has a literacy crisis. Our reading scores have been stagnant for years. Many educators aren't aware of the research on how children learn to read. And we know that most children need explicit and sustained instruction to become proficient. So that means our teachers and our administrators also need explicit and sustained professional development, something I'll talk more about in a little bit. The last time our nation's report card, the National Assessment of Education Progress, was administered was in 2019, so pre-COVID. And you can see by this slide the percentage of students that are at or above grade level and looking at disaggregated data here. So we're not doing well for any population, any subgroup. Most of our children of color, the vast majority, are reading below grade level. So tonight I want to talk about 4 things. First, what is the science of reading and why is it important for us to know about it? Second, what are we consider the core components of comprehensive literacy and how are those related to the science of reading. Third, I'm going to talk about structured literacy and why educators need to know about it. And then last, I just want to share a few lessons that I and my team, my mentors, have learned in the 21 years since we've been doing our work. We have a nation of diverse learners, and certainly California exemplifies that. And San Francisco is no exception to that. We have lots of increasing numbers of children who are considered English language learners. We have many students identified and not identified with learning disabilities and attention problems. And now we have children who have been impacted negatively by COVID. Certainly, students from disadvantage are also at greater risk for having difficulties with literacy. And this quote, which I won't read, but hopefully when you get the slides, you'll go back and read this important quote that talks about the opportunity gap and what we need to do to close it. So my first item on the agenda is the science of reading. And I think of the science of reading as the evidence, okay? And the Reading League, national organization that formed about 6 years ago, has started what they call a defining movement to spread this knowledge. What is the science of reading? It's a body of research that's been around for many years, 5 decades, and it's been derived from thousands of studies that have given us converging evidence about what reading entails, right? And so when we think about the science of reading, we know very well how proficient reading and writing develop, why some children have difficulty developing and learning these skills. We also know how to effectively assess and teach these important skills. And lastly, we know how to prevent and remediate reading difficulties. That's a lot of evidence that should support instruction. So Stanislaus Dehaene wrote a book that's in the reference section at the end of this, that is at the end of this PowerPoint, called The Reading Brain. And what we know is that all children basically learn to read the same way. The emphasis of instruction may differ depending on where the child is in a developmental progression. And those are those stages or phases of reading. And the emphasis will also differ and may depend on the strengths and weaknesses of the individual child. But as it says here, it's simply not true that there are hundreds of ways to learn to read. When it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints and the same learning sequence. And that's important for us to really understand. There is a science behind this. Now, an important principle as we learn about the science of reading and what we call structured literacy is something called the simple view. And it doesn't mean that learning to read is simple. It's just a simple idea that reading comprehension, which is the whole purpose of reading, is comprised of two very separate and distinct components. One has to do with how well we comprehend what we listen to. So it's referred to as listening comprehension or language comprehension. When you read a story to your child, can they understand what the story is about? The other component that's very different is what we refer to as decoding, basically sounding words out and knowing instantly what those words are when you see them, and you can automatically read them. You have to have both. There's a multiplication sign there for a reason, because if listening comprehension is fantastic, but decoding is very weak or non-existent, reading comprehension is going to be non-existent. You could also have fantastic decoding skills, but weak language or listening comprehension. Your reading comprehension is also going to be weak. If you want to expand that simple view of reading, we can think of the top of the rope, Hollis Scarborough's rope, as the language comprehension component of reading. And you can see there are many strands associated with language comprehension, all listed here. And again, I have lots to share this evening, so I'm not going to go through in detail this, but many of you have seen this depiction of skilled reading. At the bottom of the rope, you see the D, or what we call word recognition. And those skills really have to do with being automatic, as I mentioned before. These have to do with being strategic or metacognitive, thinking about language and thinking about what you're hearing and listening to. And what we have to do as skilled readers is fluently execute and coordinate those two components to become really efficient and be able to read and understand and do what we call deep reading. And this takes time. It starts at birth, and really we are reading to learn by the time ideally we get to third grade, but it might take 2 or 3 years to learn to read in kindergarten, first and second grade. It's a very complex set of skills that children need to master. And I always like to show a picture of the brain. This is also from Stanislaus Hahn's research, because it speaks to the fact that there are networks that we have to develop through a very explicit process of learning to read and taking the language areas of the brain that are there and that we're hardwired for to be able to speak and listen and understand, but we're not hardwired. Our brains are not hardwired to read. We have to build neurocircuitry to do that. So you can see in this cartoon all these areas of the brain that are there for language that have to get built into that neurocircuitry. And yet, when we have good instruction, even for a child who is at risk, and this picture shows a child who's at risk for having difficulty with reading based on dyslexia, you see the areas of the brain in this left hemisphere not lighting up pre-intervention, but post-intervention, we're seeing those areas that are really important to building that circuitry that I just spoke about, lighting up because they received the proper instruction. We tell our teachers that they change brains. That's very empowering. And the reading brain, as I mentioned, is where the brain has to rewire, rearrange its original parts to learn something new. One thing to mention very quickly here is that English is a difficult language. That's why it takes several years to master reading and writing. It is based on both sounds, so it's phonemic, and on meaning, so it's considered morphophonemic. Nancy Young, several years ago, put together a ladder of reading that I think is very helpful in showing us kind of the percentage of children that need explicit instruction and those that may not need as much explicit instruction. Only 5% of students, roughly, are able to read with like no real instruction, right? They just come into the world knowing how to read. An additional 35% learn to read relatively easily. But the bottom two groups here, 40 to 50%, that are not necessarily identified with dyslexia, but they still require very explicit instruction. And then those students who are identified with dyslexia that absolutely must have a code-based, explicit, systematic approach to reading instruction. Everyone benefits from structured literacy, though. That's the bottom line. Now, unfortunately, in most schools in this country, we're still using a methodology that is not based on the science of reading, and that is the multiple cueing system, otherwise known as MSV, based on the work of Ken Goodman and Mari Clay and others too, where children are given cues to look at pictures, to figure out if it makes sense based on the context of the sentence. And then last but not least, they're told to get their mouth ready to look at that first letter and try to figure out what the word is. Well, because of that, we actually have many children who suffer from dysteachia. Okay, this is not dyslexia. Dyslexia is a neurobiologically based learning disability. Dysteachia is not neurologically based. It is a term that is referring to inadequate or ill-informed instruction. And yet there are certain qualities of that or characterization of dysteachia that looks Some of it mimics dyslexia, including some of the things that are listed here. So we don't want all those children. You saw the nation's report card statistics. Most of those kids are not dyslexic. Most of those kids do not have an identifiable reading disability. They actually just did not receive the instruction they needed. And what is that instruction? We refer to that as comprehensive literacy instruction, again, based on the science, based on the National Reading Panel and their findings and all the research that has accumulated in the last 21 years since that report was written. And so we put those 5 big ideas around oral language, which we put at the core. And why is that? Because language is the foundation of learning to read, as I explained a few minutes ago. And I'm going to very quickly go through each of these core components and explain just a teeny bit about it so you have a better understanding of how that relates to structured literacy and what the instruction must look like that is based on the science of reading. So the first area of, or first component of comprehensive literacy is phonemic awareness. We often use this rocket ship to help teachers understand the levels of phonological awareness leading to full phonemic awareness. Full phonemic awareness is the end goal. That's where we go immediately. And what does that look like? It's really getting kids to hear the sounds at the beginning of words, then hear the sounds at the end of words, then in the middle of the words, ultimately being able to segment and blend the sounds in words. The 2 key methods that we teach our teachers about is something called say it and move it. And sometimes we'll use sound boxes because they can see and hear exactly how many sounds they're going to have in a word. For example, flag. There are no letters involved in phonemic awareness, and yet we know that linking phonemic awareness to phonics or to letters is actually important to do as soon as children understand those sound letter correspondences. So that's when we get into phonics, and we put spelling inside the same section of the wheel with phonics. We also teach our teachers about the importance of a speech to print versus a print to speech approach. Most kindergarten teachers that we encounter in our work with classroom teachers use a print to speech approach. And honestly, the brain is wired for language, and therefore we build from the known, which is the sounds they've been immersed in since birth. And then they link those sounds to the graphemes or the letters. And this is an example of a technique that we would use to help do that linking from the sounds in the word Beth, right? There are 3 sounds. We'd have the children move the chips down into the boxes for each sound they hear. You'll notice that TH is in 1 box. That's because TH is a digraph and it has 1 sound. So this whole process of supporting students' understanding of these sounds are represented by letters, and that is going to lead them to fluent reading. We also teach the syllable patterns because English, as I mentioned earlier, has an orthography that is deep or complex, and so it takes time to teach those patterns. And we have word houses all over our classrooms. Our hallways are filled with these word houses where children can really understand how to classify words so they can identify them accurately and automatically. We have children becoming syllable inspectors because we teach 6 different syllable patterns, and we want them to be able to understand what those patterns are and recognize them instantly. Now, in order to become fluent readers, they have to have these prerequisite skills that I just talked about. So what is fluency referring to? First, you have to be able to look at a word and read it exactly the way it's written. So that is referred to as accuracy. We look at those spelling patterns and we know how to decode them. The second criteria for fluency is automaticity. I can't be laboring over sounding out the word. I have to know what it is immediately, and that just takes some practice. The third thing is that we want to have our students be able to read in grammatical phrases. So if you look at the sentence at the bottom, I would read it this way. A gigantic oak tree in my backyard was covered with acorns throughout the fall. Each of those color-coded phrases is grammatically arranged and makes sense from that. It's meaningful. And that's what we want kids to be able to do, is read fluently, because that way they're going to be making meaning as they read. And again, comprehension is the ultimate goal. This is an infographic from the National Center on Improving Literacy. And I point you to that because there's just a plethora of information, wonderful infographics, speaking to this whole idea of fluency and what is involved in fluency. It's a really big idea when it comes to reading well, but as it says here, it's not an end in itself. It's a gateway to comprehension. So it frees the child to make meaning, to use their cognitive energy to really do the heavy lifting of thinking about what they're reading, especially if the reading is complex, if the text is complex and deep and needs, some really good thought behind it. The one area that you'll see is different here is fluency. We did replace fluency a number of years ago with syntax, and we did that because teachers were having kids read fast, but not necessarily read with prosody in these meaningful units. So we still emphasize fluency, but we're really going to help the students learn about sentences. And so we teach sentence level skills, because again, this is where we can bridge from word reading fluency to text comprehension. And first thing you have to do is teach children about a sentence. What is a sentence? A lot of them will tell you, oh, it starts with a capital letter and ends with a period, but that doesn't tell you its role. What is a sentence all about? Well, what it is, it's a namer and an action. We teach grammar as functional, right? Action words are verbs. That's pretty simple, but nouns are very abstract unless you tell children a noun names something. So a sentence has to have a namer, in this case, the dog, and the action that the dog does, the dog pants. These are all very important components of comprehensive literacy. Another core component of comprehensive literacy is vocabulary, and vocabulary is directly related to comprehension. If you don't know what those words mean, then it's going to undermine your ability to comprehend. And you'll see when I break down structured literacy in a couple minutes, you'll see vocabulary is also referred to as semantics. And vocabulary, again, is super important. When you have a moment and look at the slides later, you'll basically see from this slide that a child who's reading 1 minute a day outside of school will be exposed to 8,000 words over the course of a year. Okay, if a child is reading 20 minutes a day, they're going to be exposed to 1.8 million words. 20 minutes isn't a lot. We have to make sure our children are reading and incentivizing them to do so. So these are some principles of effective vocabulary instruction. Vocabulary isn't taught the way I was taught vocabulary years ago, and maybe some of you were taught. It's taught very interactively and engagingly, and kids have fun, and they learn the words because they're motivated and the words come out of their texts and are interesting to them. So vocabulary instruction is another core component. Inside that section of the wheel book with vocabulary, you're also going to notice that we have morphology. Morphology, as I referred a little bit ago, is part of the English language. That in this case, morphology is the study of the meaningful units of language. So if I say, that was an unbelievable book I read, the believe is your root, and you have a prefix un, and able is the suffix. So those are the morphemes, the meaningful units. And Marianne Wolf's wonderful book, Tales of Literacy for the 21st Century, really speaks to the importance in English of the semantics, right? Connecting the meaning of words. We have a ton of words in English that have multiple meanings, and this slide exemplifies that. Here you have the bear in the woods, the noun. Here we have bear with me, a verb, and unbearable, an adjective. So it can be tricky, and we have to explicitly teach this about the English language. And we do that by teaching the layers of language. This is from Marcia Henry's work. And we also teach these maps where you have the word friend as the root word, or rather the base word. And we can extend friend to unfriendliness, befriending, by adding prefixes and suffixes I spoke about a few minutes ago. And then the last section of the wheel that you see here is text comprehension. And text comprehension is together with written expression. This is the ultimate goal of reading. It requires specific strategies, vocabulary, background knowledge, some of the things that were listed at the top of Hollis Scarborough's rope that I showed you at the beginning of this webinar. So very important quote about text comprehension, and this article is referenced in the reference section at the end of the PowerPoint. Reading comprehension is not a single entity. It is actually the orchestrated product of linguistic and cognitive processes operating on text. This is a mouthful, actually, but it's super important to think about comprehension beyond just a set of strategies that are applied when we read. There is so much that is involved in being a skilled comprehender, and that's something that we do a lot, spend a lot of time teaching our teachers about. Now, just hold on to those core components, because there's actually a lot of overlap between those core components and structured literacy. So structured literacy is an approach to teaching reading. This is the application. Remember, I said the science of reading is the evidence. This is where the application comes in. This is how we have to translate what to do in the classroom. And so a simple definition of structured literacy is it is reading instruction that applies the science of reading to classroom practice. That's it in a nutshell. Easy to say, not easy to do well. It includes 6 elements that I'm going to show you in a minute that are directly related to language. Remember, language is at the core. It is at the heart of learning how to read and write. It also includes several pedagogical principles that are just good instructional practices. They work in math and science, PE, music. They're just good pedagogical principles, and I'll just talk about those briefly. So the 6 elements of structured literacy really, as I said, relate to the core components. The first is phonemic awareness that I talked a little bit about. The second is linking those sounds and letters, those phoneme grapheme relationships, teaching those explicitly. The third is teaching those spelling patterns that I mentioned, because English's orthography is not transparent like Spanish. You have to know various patterns to read accurately and automatically. Morphology that I just spoke about, those meaningful word parts. For example, in the word respectful, we have spect as a root and re-full as our affixes. And then the syntax that I just mentioned, how words are arranged in sentences. That's super important to explicitly teach our students, not just for comprehension, but for writing as well. And last but not least, the semantics, where I talked about vocabulary, the meaning of words, but not just at the word level, at the sentence level, and also at the discourse level, meaning beyond the sentence. And this slide just shows 7 principles of instruction that are good pedagogy. And everyone's list is slightly different. This is one of my favorite lists because it includes some things that are not often mentioned in terms of principles of instruction. And again, in the interest of time, so that I can make sure I have time for Q&A at the end, I'm just going to keep right on rolling through the slides. You'll have these to look at and refer to later. So I want to take the next 10 minutes or so that I have, because we're gonna have 20 minutes for Q&A, to talk about lessons learned, because this is a really important part of this evening's presentation. What have we learned over the years? Like I said, 21 years of providing support in classrooms for teachers and administrators. What are some of the important things that I want you all to think about and take away from tonight's conversation? First of all, when we talk about children that are at risk, whether they're identified with a reading disability, dyslexia, or not, okay, there's a continuum. It's not all or nothing. You can be mildly impacted by your reading difficulty. You could be moderately impacted or severely impacted. And therefore, you require a continuum of instruction. So if you're mildly impacted and you have good tier 1 instruction, your needs would probably be met right here in the gen ed classroom. Okay, if it's good instruction, okay, and that's an important qualifier. If you have a moderate reading difficulty, again, could be a reading disability, i.e. dyslexia or specific reading disability, or it could be that you are an English learner and you're having a lot of trouble learning to read and write English. You will most likely need not only good tier 1 instruction, you're going to also need another dose, a supplemental time in your day to get more differentiated small group intensified instruction. Okay, if you're severe, if your reading difficulties are severe, you're going to need all 3 tiers. And that's important, and I'm going to come back to that. This is also really important. Depending on what tier of instruction you need based on your difficulties, you're going to need teachers with a great deal of knowledge. High knowledge if you're gen ed teacher, if you're a reading specialist, the higher than that. And if you're a special ed teacher working with the most challenged children in terms of reading difficulties, attention, comorbidities with executive function, working memory, processing speed, you as the teacher must have the highest level of expertise. So most of you have probably heard of RTI, response to intervention. Some of you have heard of it as multi-tier systems of support. Many of you have heard or seen the triangle that just references primary level of prevention. This is your tier 1 gen ed. 80% of your students in a school their needs should be met in tier 1 if it's doing its job. For those children whose needs are not being met, they need an additional tier, secondary level of prevention. That's for 15% or so. And the tertiary or third level is for the remaining 5%. So I do want to take a minute to define RTI, because this is something that I have seen and my team members have seen over and over again. Schools and districts say they use RTI or MTSS to identify children, screen them, identify them, get them into, another level of support and maybe identify them. But honestly, I've not seen it executed very well in too many places, because 1, it's not understood well, and 2, it's not executed well. So this defining RTI, again, you can read these slides later, but it's integrating this assessment and intervention system within a school-wide system, maximizing student achievement. Schools identify kids who are at risk for poor learning outcomes. Progress must be monitored regularly. There's a lot that goes into it, and to do it well requires a great deal of effort, but it's what we must do for our students. It also can be used as a determination process for identifying students with specific learning disabilities, including dyslexia. And why is RTI so important? Well, we get better outcomes for kids. We also decrease expulsion, behavioral referrals, suspension rates, over-identification for special education as well. Now, one thing that I think is important for us to understand in terms of what schools and districts need to consider to apply the science of reading and get structured literacy into their schools and classrooms is to think about two different approaches to RTI. Okay, so the two most commonly used approaches are what we call problem solving approach, and the other is a standard treatment protocol, and that's just jargon for selecting a specific program. And I'm going to, next two slides will define these more clearly, but what I would say is, even though they seem different, they actually have several common elements. And in many cases, schools use both an approach for some students and a program for others. And that's totally fine, as long as it's based on the science of reading. So what is a problem-solving approach? This is where student intervention teams meet. They look at the student's data, they discuss what's going to be best for the individual student. And in many cases, the student might be complex and the programs that they have available for them might not meet their needs. So they need more of an approach like the structured literacy that I just briefly described. The quality of that instruction, however, depends on the skills of the teacher. So it's much harder to deliver an approach that's well informed because teachers have to do a lot of data collection, thinking about what their students need, versus a standard treatment protocol, which is a consistent intervention. It's also referred to as a program, right? And it has to be delivered with fidelity. The interventionist must receive comprehensive training and ongoing support. So an example of a program is Wilson Reading System that's used pervasively in the Northeast. And there's lots of other programs that you can think of. I know Spire is another program. SIPS is one that's used in California, I believe. These are programs that have to be delivered with fidelity. They have to be delivered a certain way. Again, there's a case to be made for using a program, and then there's sometimes a case to be made for using an approach. But what we don't want to see is a balanced literacy approach as the tier 1 instructional methodology. This is where students are encouraged to use word analogies and pictures or context to identify words. The instruction is focused on shared reading, guided reading, independent reading. Again, these guided reading approaches have not been, they are not based on the science of reading is the simple, short way to say it. So again, in thinking about what your district might need to think about moving forward is, how is reading being taught? And it can vary from school to school, right? But in general, you are going to see a guided reading or a balanced literacy approach, again, especially for tier 1, where teachers often have a lot of leeway and they have freedom to choose materials and activities, etc. In this scenario, they should receive professional development. They don't always. So that's a really important point to make here. If you're using an approach, they must get a lot of professional development. And that may or may not be the case. In some schools, we have core reading programs, and Ed Reports does look at those programs and rate them. So you can actually see all the different published programs. Teachers are supposed to follow the program's manual that gives them guidance. There's usually a scope and sequence. Teachers will receive professional development from the publisher, but they definitely need, even though they have a program and a manual, they still need professional development around pacing and how to differentiate instruction. So just in the couple minutes I have left here, I want to highlight a few things that we've learned from the work that we do. This is a table that shows types of professional development that teachers usually have when they receive professional development, different components or elements of professional development. First, they might learn a little theory. You can see here, very zero transfer to practice in terms of how much teachers can take away from that theory when they go back to their classrooms. If they learn, get an opportunity to see the presenter demonstrate some of the techniques, they might bump up their knowledge level and their skill attainment, but they're not going to transfer that demonstration to practice. They won't even transfer to practice by practicing whatever it is that they learn. Let's say they learn a phonemic awareness technique in that workshop. They're not going to transfer that to practice 5% because they don't have enough time to really practice it to automaticity themselves. It's not until teachers receive coaching support that they get that transfer to practice. They have to have all of these things. They also need the coaching support in their classrooms. And this slide just shows impact of coaching on one of the projects that we worked in several years ago with third grade teachers. And it was a quasi, qualitative and quantitative study where we actually looked at the teachers' practice with literacy protocols and also student outcome data. And you can see that we showed a statistically significant difference in the teachers' classrooms and for those teachers who received coaching support over the course of a year. So it was substantive, it was weekly, and it was based on assessment data. So if you're considering and talking about professional development, 5 things to think about. Obviously, you have to focus on the science of reading. You have to focus on active learning and active engagement. Teachers have to be actively engaged just as students do. There has to be a coherence. So you can't have 3 different initiatives going on in a school and expect to have alignment for those initiatives if they're not philosophically and otherwise aligned. The professional development has to stick around for more than a couple of years. It takes at least a minimum of 3 years, and usually more like 5 or 6 or 7 years sometimes, depending on the size of the school, the complexity of the population, to actually change the instruction. And lastly, you have to have collective participation. Everyone has to be all in, especially the leaders in the buildings and in the districts. So on that note, I'm just going to share some resources that I mentioned this evening. I've got a list of references here, and I thank you very, very much. And I guess we will probably take some time now to do a Q&A. So I guess I can stop sharing.
Thanks, Margie. We have some really good questions in the chat.
Great.
So I'm just going to read them to you. So the first one is, are there any large school districts across this nation that have adopted the science of reading on a large scale and improved literacy scores? What about individual schools?
Well, I'm sure there are. There are examples, large districts. I don't know of any that have sustained them for a number of years. And I do know of smaller districts that are working on that, and schools within districts, because as you well know, the larger the district, the harder it is to get alignment across all the schools. We're working right now, I'm part of an initiative in Marietta City Schools, and I know that we were considering working in Atlanta public schools, but Atlanta is a large district. I don't know how it compares in size to San Francisco, but it's a large urban district. And what we decided to do was work on a model in Marietta where we have fewer elementary schools and we can create an aligned system there. And we're studying all the elements, many of which I mentioned this evening, that must be present to create a model that will then, again, be consistent across all the schools. Again, I can't name names. What I do know, other than I just mentioned Marietta, but we're in the, this is our first year of the initiative. There are many schools that have shown great success, but really, very sadly, what happens is you get a school that has a dynamic principal like you, Nancy, and you start to turn the school around, and then the principal leaves. And depending on who comes in and takes over, it can be a matter of months where all the good work that that person did gets unraveled because the person that replaces that individual has a different philosophy of teaching, which it's crazy to think about, sad to say, but I've seen it happen many times.
Right. Yeah, leadership tenure is definitely a challenge. Here's second question. What are your recommendations for a district hoping to improve literacy outcomes, but also in the middle of a budget crisis?
I think you have to invest in really good professional development, which I did talk a little bit about. Really invest in your teachers and give them the time they need to learn the science of reading. It takes years to really learn it, and not just theoretical knowledge. I'm talking about the application of it. I'm talking about what does it look like in the classroom with students. That means they have to have dedicated time to engage in professional development outside of their classrooms. That means they have to have dedicated time with a coach, reflection time to talk to the coach, not 5 minutes in the hall when they're running to lunch. They have to be able to wrap their heads around, you know, a change in how they've been teaching. I also feel very, very strongly, and I know you would agree with this, Nancy, is the administrators must have the same, not the same level of knowledge that the teachers have, but they have to understand reading really well. Because at the end of the day, it's the administrator who walks into the teacher's classroom and evaluates their performance. No one else can do that. The coach can't do that. The peers can't do that. It's only you, the principal. And if the principal doesn't know what to look for and what you know, competencies they should be seeing on the part of the teacher, and also what the students' performance should look like, then it can't happen, right? The strong leader makes all the difference, both at the school and at the district level.
All right, here's question number 3. In your experience, what has been the perceived greatest challenge in implementing structured literacy?
Honestly, I sad to say this, but I think we're so entrenched in false or faulty methodologies, including guided reading, balanced literacy, whatever you want to call it, based on basically having kids guess words or read words by sight. Just teachers teaching kids to do things that are absolutely not based on science, and it's not their fault. So I'm not faulting teachers by any means. It's really, unfortunately, how they learn to teach. And I think higher education absolutely carries some of that blame in terms of changing how they're teaching and preparing pre-service teachers and even graduate students. I'm involved in a project where we're looking at a state's courses, their course syllabi. We're interviewing faculty. We're really digging deep into what they're using, what their courses are consisting of. And it's unbelievable how, I don't want to say antiquated, but how they're not based on the science. And wonderful people with good intentions, but look, that is the bottom of the food chain. That's where teachers start their preparation. And if they don't get it right before they start teaching, you know, Nancy, it's really difficult to change what a teacher's doing in their classroom once they've been trained in pre-service coursework. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle. There's lots of things. Publishing companies haven't been held accountable. So they can turn out materials that are not based on the science of reading, and people are going to buy them anyway. So there's a lot that's, I think, challenging. But having said all of that, I am feeling very encouraged. I'm seeing changes happen. Sometimes they feel not like they're not happening fast enough, but they're happening. And I'm very encouraged by that.
Okay, here's the next question. Do you have suggestions for engaging parents and or guardians in supporting literacy at home?
There's so much parents and guardians can do. Absolutely. I mean, even if the parents don't have strong literacy skills themselves, I always get upset when parents are told, read to your children. Well, what if they can't read to their children? What if they don't have the literacy skills? You don't have to know how to read to be able to help your child. You can have rich conversations with them. You can look at a book together and talk about the book. You can go to the grocery store and talk about what they see in the grocery store. It's really the language that I think is critically important for families and parents and guardians to engage in, and the kinds of questions that parents and guardians can ask their children, not factual memory questions, but thinking questions. And the more thinking questions you ask your child, it's amazing. Like, I have 3 little grandchildren, and I love to ask those questions because you get some insight into what's happening in their little minds. And the more of those questions you can ask them, I think the greater the brain development is. So yeah, there's a lot parents can do. Talk.
Yeah, I love that, because reading with your child can be a very passive process. Like, my kids
Absolutely.
want the same books read every single day, and you're calling for active engagement and dialogue and talking to your kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Here's a, it's like a super question. There's like 3 questions in one. How might structured literacy support emerging bilingual students? How does it work in biliteracy programs? San Francisco has schools with immersion programs as well as Spanish biliteracy programs, and all the schools have English language development for students learning English. So that's
yeah, that's a
question.
That's a lot. There's a lot in that question, and I am, not an ELL expert at all. I certainly am familiar with the kinds of programs you're talking about, and whoever asked this question. We have lots of similar programs in our schools as well. I think that structured literacy, because it's based on the elements of language, all those things I highlighted, right? Phonemic awareness is phonology, morphology, those are all the strands of language. And so if you think about the English language learner, no matter what language they speak, they have their own phonology, their own syntax, their own structures of language. And the more teachers understand about that, they don't have to know how to speak all the different languages. They just have to understand, for example, English has 44 sounds. How many sounds are in another, an English learner's language? Do they have the same sounds, or are their sounds different? Are they speaking an alphabetic system, or rather an alphabetic language like, Spanish? Or are they speaking a logographic language like Chinese? And that matters, just understanding that much. So I think structured literacy is based on very important aspects of language and knowing that. I also think that understanding the role that a language-rich classroom plays in all students' lives, but really importantly for those children who are English learners, right? Those language-rich classrooms, immersion in English or whatever the other languages are going to provide the support that the students need to develop oral language skills, because oral language skills are going to precede the reading and writing skills. If you can't speak something, if you can't speak a complete sentence, you're not going to be able to read and write it very well, or comprehend and write it very well. So the oral language rehearsal that we are advocating our teachers do routinely throughout the day, are those techniques are going to support the English learners. And those are all very much tied to a structured literacy approach. I hope I answered all those. I'm thinking, is there anything else? I mean, there's so much. The other thing I would say is I didn't really say too much about assessments, but I want to just take a minute to talk about that, because when you ask the question about recommendations to improve literacy outcomes, right, and not having a big budget, it's so imperative that you have the right assessments. So you have to have a good screener, a good universal screener that every child is, it's administered for every child 3 times a year. The benchmarks are clear. If you don't reach the benchmarks, you have to, consider, it's the RTI, right, methodology. You have to consider another tier of instruction, but you have to have diagnostic assessments to really pinpoint where the specific breakdown is occurring. And then equally important, you have to monitor the student's progress on a regular basis. So having a really well articulated assessment plan is really important. And I think that is imperative for the children who are in those bilingual programs, assessing them in English, but also assessing them in that other language, and knowing the difference between their proficiency in those different languages, making sure you have those same, like I said, screeners, diagnostic assessments, and progress monitoring assessments. That's critically important. And then teaching the teacher how to be analytical with a child's, even their informal writing. You can tell so much about what's going on if teachers learn how to analyze the children's writing samples and listening to them read, etc.
All right, thank you, Margie. Here's another one. If a district or school wants to make the change to structured literacy, what first steps do you recommend? Do you invest in teacher training in the science of reading first? Or do you invest in curriculum and instructional resources? Do you recommend starting with a single grade level team or the whole faculty?
That's a great question. I've done it. We've done it both ways, where we had schools adopt new programs and we had our coaches in those schools, and the coaches were, the teachers thought the coaches worked for the publishing company, and they were so focused on learning how to put that new program into action. The coaches really, they weren't utilized optimally. So I think if you're going to adopt a core reading program, you need to get the publishing company. First, it has to be based on the science, of course. And then you have to get the publishing company, whoever publishes that program, to give the teachers substantive professional development where they really feel confident using that program, and give them a year to know, to try it out and practice and do all of that. And then bring in your coaching support, because it's hard to do both at once. Now, you could, if you're thinking about adopting a core reading program, you could, and you're going to do it a year from now, it would actually be really great to front load the teachers with the knowledge of the science of reading. And then when they go to adopt the program, they're going to actually be in a better place to apply that program well, because they'll have the background knowledge that they need on the science of reading. So, I mean, there's no only one way to do it, but thinking it through makes a lot of sense, and thinking about the supports that need to be in place. In terms of, I mean, again, in one of our districts that we've worked in the last 6 years, there's a 13 elementary schools. So it's not a big district, certainly not like San Francisco. And they wanted to pilot one of the core reading programs that's out there. And they had one school pilot it. And then next year they had 3. This year they have 3 more. So half of the schools now are using this specific program, and they phased it in. So they phased it in with K and 1. And then the next year, that first school brought in 2nd and 3rd grade. I mean, there's something to be said for doing it slowly, because it just you have limited resources to give everybody what they need and to do it well. So I don't have a problem with phasing it in, as long as everybody knows what the plan is going to be and that this is how we're going to roll it out, if you will. You know, but I also know schools that have done it school-wide, and that works okay too. I'm not wedded to only one way. I think you want to think about what your support staff is going to look like to provide what the resources and really it's the human resources that are most important, coaching, support, etc.
Yeah, it sounds like you're talking about buy-in,
Yes,
and also the culture of the district and the school
absolutely.
and the readiness. Yeah.
Definitely.
This question says, curious to know if your training has ever been requested by hearing officers or state level special education complaints.
Yes. Yeah, it has been actually. And we just don't have the capacity, unfortunately, to do too much of that. But yes, absolutely. There's such a great need, and I wish we could, you know, fill all the requests and be able to supply all the needs, but we've tried to narrow what we do so we can do it well and not spread ourselves too thin.
I'm going to ask one more question because we're at time. It's 7:30. And then you'll probably flash your contact if people have additional questions. The last question is, does the dyslexia continuum include, quote, profound as well?
I mean, it would depend on how you define profound versus severe. I don't know if profound is in terms of intellectual disability. Certainly dyslexia in this case exists on a continuum as well. So you can be twice exceptional and dyslexic and have an IQ of 140, and you can have an IQ of 75 and have characteristics of dyslexia as well. So again, that continuum applies for several cognitively as well as in terms of reading achievement. This is my contact information. Always like to hear from people. Certainly, if you haven't visited our website, we'd love to have you join us. All you have to do is sign up to get a newsletter. And as I said, we always welcome, I will respond to emails, maybe not immediately, but I love to hear from people. And I hope that I've been able to answer questions this evening and give some information that's useful for our audience.
Thank you so much, Margie. I've been
You're
telling
very
people that you
welcome.
were my literacy soulmate, so I'm glad we're out now and people know.
I am too, Nancy. It was so nice to talk to you.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.